Chapter 3 will focus on cognitive development during adolescence and emerging adulthood. This lecture will consist of 3 videos, the first looking at Piaget, the second looking at information processing and practical cognition, and the third looking at social cognition and the adolescent brain. Let's start by going over some of the basics of what we're talking about today. When I say cognitive development, I'm referring specifically to patterns of thought, problem solving, memory, attention, and how those change and/or stay the same across the lifespan. You can think of cognition as the thought aspect of your brain, anything that is involved in how we think about the world, about our problems, about other people, which of course involves memory, attention, learning, language, and so on and so forth. Our kind of foundational cognitive theorist when it comes to cognitive development was a man named Jean Piaget. He actually used to work in a field that involved intelligence testing. He would give basically IQ tests to children, and over time he started to notice trends. Kids of the same age that he was performing intelligence tests on tended to provide the same logic for their answers. His observations didn't have much to do with whether or not they got the answers correct or incorrect, but rather the trends, the approaches, the logic that they would use to answer each question. These discoveries prompted him to develop a stage theory of cognition, where he very much believed that at specific age ranges, we learned new skills and applied different types of logic to our thinking. So he came up with 4 stages: sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and the formal operational. We will primarily be concerned with the formal operational stage, which he believed we reach early in adolescence. These are different cognitive stages, so periods of distinct cognitive patterns that Piaget believed we noticed in most children and adults within that range. And the primary patterns that we see here are called mental structures, organized patterns of thought, our kind of default way of thinking about the world that we use anytime we are facing a cognitive challenge. Piaget also believed that the primary force motivating development, allowing us to move from one stage to the other, was maturation. That means that he thought that there was a genetic basis to our cognitive development, where development happens in a preset stage. We have to reach a certain age in order for our genetics to trigger the next stage of thought. Because of that, Piaget very much believed that genes determined how we thought during a specific age range, and change can only happen at a certain age. This means that in order to be in the pre-operational stage and to use pre-operational skills, you have to be between age 2 to 7. We know now that this is not necessarily true, that a lot of aspects of each of these stages can be reached earlier or later during development, depending on the individual. So while Piaget's theory does teach us a lot about how cognition changes, he very much overestimated the importance of maturation and underestimated the role that experience plays in cognitive development. But regardless, he did contribute a lot to our overall understanding of cognition. One of the most important aspects of his theory is the idea of the schema. A schema is the way we mentally organize information and knowledge. You can actually think about our memories, the information we know, the way we conceptualize the world as functioning like a filing cabinet, where we combine similar information in specific places and link them together to make them make sense, to make them organized. So a schema is any collection of information about a specific concept and how it relates to other similar concepts. And Piaget did believe that we develop these through experience with the world. So he was developing a more complex understanding of the role experience plays with schemas, just not so much with our specific cognitive patterns from age to age. So let's take a quick second and look in a little bit more detail at his specific stages. The sensory motor stage, ages 0 to 2, involves coordination of motor activities in the senses. Very basic. We're learning what our bodies do and how they impact the world. During the next stage, the preoperational stage, we gain the ability to use symbolic representation, where we understand that, for example, the number 2 actually symbolizes 2 of something. But we're not yet able to engage in mental operations, where we can actually think through things, think through processes, understand cause and effect in our head without seeing it in front of us. The concrete operational stage, which does make up the beginning of the adolescent period, is when we start being able to do those mental operations, manipulate things in our head without having to do them in front of us. But we're limited in our logic. We can't think hypothetically. We can really only apply logic to things we have firsthand experience with. Once we move later into adolescence, into the formal operational period, we become much more capable of complex thought. So, what are the things that define the formal operational stage? Formal operations are symbolic thoughts that involve hypothesis and possibilities. You can think of formal operations as gaining the ability to use scientific thinking, higher abstract logic, without needing that concrete first-hand experience with something. Piaget thought that we reach all of our formal operational abilities by the end of adolescence. An example of something we gain the ability to do during the formal operational stage is the pendulum problem. If you look at the picture here, you'll notice that this problem involves a pendulum, a thing that swings back and forth, a bunch of different lengths of string, and a bunch of different weights. Each of these weights weighs a different amount. When you're completing or working on the pendulum problem, you're asked to figure out how to make the pendulum swing as fast as possible. This actually involves something called hypothetical deductive reasoning, where we understand that you have to hold one variable constant while testing out each of the other variables. So you tie one string to the pendulum and then you test out each individual weight on that string. Then you switch out the string and once again try all of the weights. So you're testing every single potential combination. This is actually something that younger children do not do. They're more likely to just tie a string to a weight and test each individual or each single combination to see which one works without testing all combinations. So you can see how this is a much higher level logical reasoning. We're no longer doing random attempts, but actually engaging in real hypothetical deductive reasoning, higher level scientific thought. This we can describe as abstract thinking, where we think in terms of symbols and ideas and concepts and logic. Another important part of abstract thinking is our ability to understand broad concepts that aren't concrete, things like friendship, love, culture. Younger children can't do this. They don't understand all of the abstract ideals or ideas behind these broad concepts. Adolescents during the formal operational stage also gain a lot of ability to engage in complex thinking, specifically the ability to account for multiple interpretations, multiple connections, where I can say a sentence to somebody, and depending on who that person is, they might interpret that sentence in a lot of different ways. They might connect it to different things that I haven't thought of. A lot of this comes down to the ability to engage in something called metacognition, our ability to think about thinking, or thinking about how thought works. Not only do we gain a better ability to assess our own thought processes, where we can start asking ourselves, hey, did I understand what that person just said? Am I letting myself get emotional here? Do I need her to restate that? But also gain more ability to understand how other people's thought works. A couple of other interesting outcomes of the formal operational period. Teenagers also gain the ability to understand multiple meanings. That one word can mean a lot of different things, depending on the tone it's said in, the expression on someone's face when they say it, and the context surrounding it. We gain the ability to engage in the use of metaphor and sarcasm. If you have a teenager, I'm sure you have seen this happen firsthand. Teenagers are very big into using sarcasm to help them express their feelings, their desires, which actually illustrates a gain in complex thought, complex cognition. Like I said, Piaget thought that cognitive development ends once we master formal cognition. More recent theories suggest that there is, in fact, an additional cognitive stage that we enter into during emerging adulthood. We call this post-formal thought, where we have a greater understanding of the complexity of real life. Teenagers tend to think more in black and white, where there's not a lot of middle ground. There's right and there's wrong. More mature adults understand that life is more complex than that. We're not as strict with our thinking about what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad. We call this pragmatism. Pragmatism is the ability that adults develop to adapt their logic to real-world or practical situations. An example here is understanding that lying is sometimes necessary. A teenager might have the moral sense that it's never okay to lie, so they're never going to tell a lie. But sometimes a lie can spare someone's feelings or actually help a situation. That's more pragmatic thought. Another example is maybe understanding that sometimes you have to do what your boss says to do instead of what you think the right thing to do is, because it's going to end up benefiting you or benefiting the big picture. Teenagers are not as good as emerging adults and young adults at understanding this type of pragmatism. We also develop something called dialectic thought during emerging adulthood, where we understand that problems don't just have one solution. They can have multiple solutions, but more than that, those solutions can conflict with one another. You can have two valid options to take to solve a problem. Those options can very much disagree with one another, but that doesn't mean that one of them is correct or more right than the other. Again, this is very pragmatic as well. We also start to engage in something called reflective judgment, where I'm using logic to analyze the validity of specific options. I can actually analyze how logical something is and assess the evidence behind an argument when I'm trying to decide what's right or wrong. I'm not just going to rely on my feelings about something when making a decision, but rather listen to the argument, decide if it was logical, decide if there's evidence for it before I make a decision. For example, if you're trying to, say, pick your future career, an adolescent is much more likely to say, yeah, I want to be a doctor because I want to help people and that's what excites me. An emerging adult has the greater ability to actually say, hey, how many years of school is it going to take me to become a doctor? How much is it going to cost? Are there other options that I might enjoy more once I'm considering the pragmatic side of things, the evidence that is that job going to be a great option in the future? Again, reflective judgment involves a lot of pragmatism, but we're more concerned with analyzing logic than relying on our emotions. Adolescents are more likely to use dualistic thinking, where we're seeing that right or wrong polarized interpretation of a problem. I should be a doctor because I want to help people, rather than, well, there might be some downsides to being a doctor as well. In early adulthood or emerging adulthood, we learn to use that multiple thinking, where, hey, there's going to be some pros and cons to this decision no matter what I do, so I need to spend more time analyzing this situation. We also use relativism, where we understand that those conflicting views, those conflicting decisions can both be valid. Because we gain the ability to use this reflective judgment during emerging adulthood, we actually start to commit to specific options near the end of this period. That brings me to the end of lecture video 1. We'll pick up with lecture video 2, looking at information processing.